So now, ladies and gentlemen, live and in colour, it's Mr. Wayne Lovejuice.
The other day our producer Louis had a chat with an interesting chappie who said that the YouTube algorithm really aren't that happy. If a channel only broadcasts once a week, so we've decided we can text ya whenever we've got a piece of news in our new book On The Track Xtra. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got two old friends come to visit us in the studio today. It's Cara and it's Ralph the Monster. What are you here to do today, Cara and Ralph the Monster?
So Ralph, what's coming up? Book review.
Well, as anybody who's known me and Richard Freeman for any length of time will attest, the biggest thing we've got in common, we've got a lot of things in common, but I think the biggest thing we've got in common is that we're both book freaks. And as a result, every time Richard comes here, he makes a beeline up to the CFZ library. Yes, we do have a library upstairs. And he makes a beeline to the library and he finds some books to review and brings them down and plonks himself in front of the camera in my little studio here. And we start. And so, Richard, what have we got with us today?
We've got the hardback version of F.W. Holliday's The Dragon and the Disc.
Now, Ted Holliday is quite a remarkable writer, isn't he? Because he started off believing in the Lochness Monster as a straightforward lake monster dinosaur-y thing.
Well, he started off originally writing books about angling. He wrote books on how to catch trout and stuff, and then after he saw the Loch Ness Monster, he had one of the longest views of the Loch Ness Monster ever for about 45 minutes, and on the other side of the loch another bunch of people saw it, including the police officer. Do you remember there's a famous police officer who saw it, and one of the most famous sightings? And I actually, when I was at Loch Ness, I talked to his son, and then this guy had just passed away and I talked to his son about it.
Yeah, we were just wake totally by accident,
yeah,
weren't we?
Yeah, we were, yeah. So in his first book, The Great Orm of Loch Ness, he postulates that the Loch Ness Monster might be some ancestor of the squid and the octopus, some sort of mollusk, maybe related to a prehistoric, what was then thought to be a prehistoric worm called a Monstrum, which had been found in fossil form in North America, but the Monstrum was only about yay big. And now we know the Monstrum, its closest living relative, are lampreys. So
are they?
Yes, the Monstrum, its closest living relative is the lamprey.
So the Monstrum isn't a worm, it's a chordate of some
Yes.
description.
What they thought were little flippers were eyes on stalks, and it had this long proboscis with teeth at the end. But it has no relationship whatsoever to the Loch Ness Monster, and it was one of the most unlikely and lame theories as to what the Loch Ness Monster was if it was a physical animal. But by the time he wrote his second book, The Dragon and the Disc, in 1974, he changed his mind. Now, the early 70s were a classic time for Fortean. 1973, the world went mad. There were all sorts of insane sightings of Bigfoot with UFOs. There were waves of lake monster sightings. I write about this in my new book, The Highest Strangeness. 73, high strangeness peaked. It just went off the scale with weirdness. And this book came out the year after, 1974. The 70s in general, Bob Fisher calls it the haunted generation, and he's right, because Forteana in general peaked in the 70s, and particularly in 73. But by the time he got round to writing The Dragon and the Disc, he thought that there was something very strange about the Loch Ness Monster, that it wasn't a physical flesh and blood animal at all. Anytime anybody tried to photograph it or film it, their camera went wrong. People that saw it would have terrible runs of bad luck, almost as if they'd been cursed. What today would be called psychic backlash by some people. And he came to the conclusion that the Loch Ness Monster was literally a dragon. It was a malevolent, serpentine, spiritual entity, and that it was linked with UFOs, which also were not alien spaceships. They were part of this same paranormal phenomenon.
Seems alright. Do you want a spare
Oh,
folder
wonderful.
to put them in?
That would be lovely, thank you. We can cut, can't we, then?
Yeah.
That's great, Graham. Thanks so much.
Yeah, problem.
Graham, will you order some ink for it?
Yeah, I'll see if I can get the printer to do it for us.
Oh yes, the printer orders it itself, doesn't it?
Well, it will if I tell it to. All it does is issue a warning that it's getting low and asks if I want to click on the link
Thanks a
to
lot,
get
Graham.
more. That's what we did last time. The price seemed reasonable, so
Yeah. Where do you get it from?
that's some HP sub-supplier. I can't remember it precisely where.
No, it's not Amazon or eBay or an ordinary shop.
No.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, mate.
Yeah, that draft mode made it quite speedy, really.
Yeah, and it's perfectly readable, isn't it?
Yes, it's perfectly readable.
Oh, yeah.
Right, where should we pick it up from?
A dragon.
He believed that the Loch Ness Monster and related phenomena around the world were not a flesh and blood animal, not a surviving plesiosaur or a giant eel or a prehistoric whale or a long-necked seal. They were literally dragons, malevolent paranormal entities that had a baleful influence on those that saw them. And he believed that UFOs were not alien spaceships, but they were wound up together in the same phenomenon. They were two sides of the same coin, and he believed that prehistoric peoples knew about these things and that they recorded both lake monsters and UFOs in their art, and also in the architecture of how they made buildings. And he talked to people who had seen lake monsters and had been terribly frightened by them. There was one man and his wife that had moved to a house lane at Loch Ness, and they saw something out of the lake that they described as being obscene. They said the creature was obscene, and even after it'd gone, a air of obscenity was left behind it. And he talked to a woman called Georgina Carberry, who had seen a monster in Loch Fadda with some friends when she was fishing, and she'd been so scared by it that she thought that when they were driving away from the loch, because they ran away in terror and drove away, that somehow it was following them or pursuing them in a psychic manner, and she had nightmares about it for years, and she would never go back to the loch for years and years, and then when she did return she would never go after dark. And this idea of pursuit, we've seen it before, we've heard about it in other cases. One of the Owlman witnesses, who I know very well, said after he'd seen the Owlman in Morne and Smith in Cornwall, he had an idea that it pursued him back home. He lived miles and miles away in a different county, and that somehow it pursued him home and was lurking in the woods outside of his house.
And he had dreams, didn't he? That the owl man was making him hunt and kill people with a bow and arrow.
Yes, and then when we were investigating the monster of Bowlam Lake, which was a Bigfoot-like creature seen in a place called Bowlam Lake, a few miles south of Newcastle, of all places. And obviously there can't be a flesh and blood animal in a 100-acre park, but people had seen this weird phantom creature, had this feeling of pursuit. We talked to a woman called Naomi and her son that had seen it whilst they were parked up in a car park, and they drove away because they were so frightened of it. They said it was standing still, but somehow it felt like it was rushing towards them, even though it's standing still. And when they were driving away, they had this feeling of pursuit, like it was after them. Now, I mean, there are some things wrong with this book. I mean, he gives credit to the surgeon's photograph, which we know now as a hoax, and the Cottingley fairies, which are obvious hoaxes. And he does get a little bit, he lets his imagination run away with himself, gets wound up in it a bit, and becomes a little bit paranoid. You see how his books progress. In his final book, which was published after his death, The Goblin Universe, he starts to get very paranoid, thinking that these forces are actually stalking him. This malevolent force is stalking him. But another interesting thing about this book is that around about the same time that this was happening, a guy called the Reverend Dr. Donald Ormond, who was an exorcist, was coming to the same conclusions, that lake monsters and sea serpents were not flesh and blood creatures but were malevolent dragons. He had an encounter with a sea serpent in the fjord of Trolls in Norway, and the captain of the boat he was on, a local man, told him it was a spiritual evil creature, and he ended up exercising Loch Ness in 1975, the year after this book came out, unsuccessfully, but he thought that this was a demonic evil entity, a literal dragon, a lot like F.W. Holiday did. And it's a great book in that it's a window into the past, into how people thought in the early 70s and what the Fortean fashions were then, and their modes of thinking and linking things together. And in some ways I think he's right, in some ways he's wrong, in some ways he's right, because I explore something similar in my new book, High Strangeness. In some ways I'm going back to the early 70s and their modes of thinking. Now, I think the Loch Ness Monster, most of it is genuine mistakes of an ordinary phenomenon, like seals getting into the locks and sea waves and boat wakes and water birds and things like that, and debris being pulled by undercurrents. I think some of it refers to very large fish like huge eels and sturgeons, but I think there could be a case to be made that some of it is paranormal. A friend of mine, a guy called Warren Speed, was up at Loch Ness filming a documentary about the paranormal aspects of Loch Ness, like Aleister Crowley and his magical experiments with the ritual of Abramel in the Mage at Boleskine House, where he was supposed to have summoned up ancient entities, including Leviathan, which was a Hebrew sea dragon. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. But he says when he was up there, he and the producer were driving along beside the loch, and they saw this immense hump come up out of the loch, and he said it was like the back of a whale. It was enormous, and they both saw it, and it swam along, turned around, and then dived again, and it was something animate, they said, and the size they were giving it is just too vast for any flesh and blood animal that in that lake. Nothing that big could actually physically get into the lake through the Moray Firth or the River Ness. Bigger than an elephant. It couldn't get in there, and there's not enough food to support it. So unless they saw a submarine disguised as a monster, I think they saw something paranormal.
Even if they saw the submarine disguised as a monster, how the hell would that get into the lake?
Exactly. And there are a lot of these Loch Ness Monster sightings that sound like something really weird. And Hollidays ties them together with UFOs as part of a bigger phenomenon, and in that I think he's right. Balls of light are one of the keys to it. Great book. Search it out. You can get it on eBay and A Books and Amazon. It turns up second hand. Try and get hold of a copy, because it's a Fortean classic from the age when Forteana and High Strangeness was in the ascendant.